Over the farmland in the northern part of Lower Saxony, the morning air always carried a damp, faint sweetness. It was a scent that existed only around dairy farms, a smell made from grass, earth, wooden fences, and the warmth of fresh cream mixed together. Hanna Klein was born here. Her father owned a dozen cows, and every morning at 5, he would push open the wooden door of the cowshed to draw the first pail of milk. Her mother would put a pot of water on in the kitchen, getting ready to boil the freshest milk until it just began to tremble so that the skin of cream could slowly rise to the surface. In Hannah's childhood, this scene never changed. Her earliest memory was of standing by the stove, watching her mother lift the cream with a wooden spoon, the thick white layer seeming to have the power to make the entire world fall quiet. After the war broke out, the young men in the village were drafted one after another. The workload on the dairy farms grew heavier and heavier, and the government's requisition of milk increased year by year. By 1942, there were almost no families in the village who could still keep enough fresh milk for themselves as they had before the war. The last time Hannah drank real milk was on a winter morning. In order to give her a little strength in the cold days, her mother poured all the remaining small pot of fresh milk into the milk pan. The layer of cream on top was so thick it could almost be pinched up between 2 fingers. She did not know that this would be the last time in the next 5 years that she would taste that flavor. It was also in that year that the state began intensifying the recruitment of air defense auxiliaries across the country. Radio broadcasts, posters, and women's organizations came into the countryside one after another, stressing the role of German women in modern war. They could operate rangefinders, record data, manage fire control, and assist with anti-aircraft gun positions. When the recruiting officers arrived in the village, the teacher volunteered Hannah's name, saying that her gift for mathematics and her eyesight were almost innately suited to this kind of work. Her family was opposed at first, but as the war intensified, many households had grown accustomed to the phrase, "Let the children shoulder greater responsibilities." Even more important was the fact that Hannah's brother was serving on the Eastern Front, and almost everyone in the family believed that as long as the cities could be protected from being bombed, as long as the national defenses still held, perhaps he might return alive in some future winter. And so, Hannah was selected. She left the dairy farm, left the kitchen that always smelled of cream in the early mornings, and was sent to an air defense training center in the Ruhr area. It was the first time she had seen a true industrial city. Chimneys stood in dense rows, factories ran day and night, and trains dragged freight cars laden with supplies, roaring along the tracks. There was nothing romantic about her training. Every mark on the rangefinder, every fire control calculation, every conversion of enemy aircraft speed and altitude, every adjustment of lead angle for firing had to be completed within a few seconds. Any delay could mean a volley of artillery fired into empty sky and one more ruin added to the city. She adapted to this rhythm faster than anyone else. One instructor once said, "This girl can hear the sky move in the smoke." Words as exaggerated as that had no place in a formal report, but within the unit they quietly used it as a way of referring to her. Whenever a night raid began and the searchlights cut across the sky, Hannah could always determine the distance to the enemy aircraft in the shortest time and relay the firing data to the gun crews. Her accuracy was far ahead of anyone else in the unit. On one occasion, the entire fire control system was shaken so violently that it almost failed. And it was she who, relying on experience and intuition, gave an approximate value. The result was that a volley of fire exploded into the first ball of flame in the night sky. After that raid, everyone in the camp knew her name, but no one would ever see such achievements reported in the newspapers, because she was only an auxiliary, not part of the true combat establishment. Her record would forever exist only in the stories passed by word of mouth inside the camp. As the war went on, the Ruhr region became the primary target of Allied bombing. It took her less than a year to go from the tension of the first air raid to numbness in the face of ruins. The city was bombed into devastation, factories turned into charred wreckage, and civilians suffocated in air raid shelters. After every raid, Hanna would walk along the streets past shattered houses. Sometimes she would see a milk advertisement poster, blackened by smoke and dust, with the words, "Children must receive dairy fat every day," printed on it, a slogan from before the war that had now become completely impossible to fulfill. She herself did not know when she had started to become light. The belt moved in notch after notch, her hair became fine and brittle, and her menstrual cycle came and went unpredictably. The food in camp was roughly the same every day: black bread, thin soup, ersatz coffee. One night she suddenly realized that she had not tasted any real fat for a very long time. Aside from the occasional ration of a small square of margarine, she had not come into contact with any thick, creamy dairy fat. When that flavor has been absent for too long, a person begins slowly to forget that the body was once able to rely on it to live. By the end of 1944, the Ruhr region was almost no longer a city at all, but a flattened industrial wasteland. The anti-aircraft positions kept pulling back, and the entire front line was like a piece of cloth coming apart, tearing bit by bit from the edges. By early 1945, her unit finally received orders to retreat inland. She and her comrades dragged their equipment through snow and ice, moving along clogged roads and through streams of refugees. She saw elderly women pushing handcarts heaped with rags, boys of 14 or 15 in ill-fitting uniforms being driven to the front, and horses so thin they looked like shadows. In that moment, she realized for the first time that no matter how many enemy aircraft she had helped to shoot down in the past, no matter how she had been praised as the unit's genius fire control hand, the war had grown far larger than the strength of any one person. During one chaotic retreat, they were encircled by American troops. There was hardly any fighting before they received the order to lay down your weapons and move to the roadside. For the first time, Hanna's hands left the grips of the rangefinder and never returned to them. She was placed into a column of prisoners and processed as an auxiliary soldier for registration and screening. She heard the male prisoners beside her say that the Americans would starve them, humiliate them, and put them to the hardest labor. Others said that the food in American camps was better than at the German front. Rumors drifted everywhere like smoke. No one knew the truth. But very soon, she was selected to be sent to the American mainland. The reasons were not complicated. She was low risk, of labor value, suitable for long-term management, and the number of female prisoners was small, so they were usually assigned to rear area camps. She stood at the harbor looking at the huge grey transport ship heaving gently on the water. She could smell the scent of sea wind mixed with diesel, a smell just as unfamiliar because it belonged to none of the seasons in Germany. On the voyage across the Atlantic, she drank milk made from milk powder for the first time. The Americans supplied a standardized hot beverage on the ship, a white, thin, sweet liquid. She held the cup and sniffed it, and an odd emptiness rose in her heart. That was not milk. It had none of the weight of dairy fat, none of the aroma of cream, nothing at all that she recognized. It even struck her as somewhat desolate, as if the entire world had ceased to produce real milk. When the transport ship reached the American Midwest, what she saw was a landscape so flat that it was almost impossible to tell direction, with fields, grain silos, and indistinct pasture-covered slopes in the distance. On the truck ride to the prisoner-of-war camp, she saw herds of dairy cows moving slowly across the pastures and even heard the sound of lowing carried on the wind. In that instant, it was as if something lodged in her throat. She had thought she had forgotten that sound, yet it made her knees go weak. It was one of the clearest sounds of her childhood, and one she had not heard for many years. In the camp's mess hall, the prisoners received rations of white bread, meat, sugar, and drinks made from milk powder. For someone who had lived through the hunger of the air defense units, this was an unimaginable abundance, and yet she still never drank real milk. Every morning she watched the cooks pour milk powder into large vats, add water and stir, steam rising. The scene repeated itself again and again, and it made her unconsciously aware that the true taste of cow's milk had gone far away from her, so far that it felt like a flavor wartime had scalded out of her tongue. As the truck rattled along the gravel road toward the camp, Hanna saw rows of domed grain silos in the fields, their silver metal walls reflecting a harsh brightness in the sunlight. Buildings like that were almost never seen in Germany. They were like man-made hills, standing over the endless expanse of land. Outside the truck, she occasionally caught sight of dairy cows walking at an unhurried pace, their bodies steady, their coats clean, as if they had stepped out of pre-war advertising posters. For someone who had spent years in the ruins of Germany, this scene had a kind of unreal cleanliness. Hanna gripped the wooden side of the truck bed tightly, yet inside she felt as if something had been pried open, a long-lost smell of cattle, a faint mixture of grass and cream, utterly different from the air in the Ruhr, heavy with smoke and tar. She forced herself not to show any reaction. She saw the male prisoners beside her staring into the distance with wary, exhausted eyes, as if at any moment this land too might suddenly collapse like the battlefields of Europe. The American prisoner of war camp was not what she had imagined. The barracks were laid out in neat rows. Wooden fences drew straight boundaries, and on the guard towers there was none of the cold, oppressive atmosphere of German concentration camps, but rather a kind of procedural, regulated vigilance. On entering the camp, American officers carried out routine checks of prisoner identities, recording her name and branch of service one by one. On the registration form, she saw that she had been categorized under Air Force Auxiliary Personnel, Fire Control Group, followed by several English letters that looked a little rough to her eye. The interrogating officer confirmed that she had not taken direct part in combat, and in the end wrote only 2 almost emotionless lines in the file. German female service member, low risk, no enemy intelligence value, suitable for labor camp assignment. Looking at those words, she suddenly realized that within this unfamiliar system, she had become so light as to be almost weightless. The achievements passed from mouth to mouth in her old unit. The enemy aircraft whose heights she had gauged in night raids by experience and intuition, the nights that had become legend in the camp, here in the Americans' writing, all of it had been reduced to impersonal classification codes. She did not feel any resentment at this. Instead, it was as if a weight had been lifted, as if here no one would treat her as a tool of the battlefield. The mess hall in the American camp was completely different from a German military canteen. The light was bright, the wooden floorboards were clean, and the cooks ladled food onto metal trays with practiced movements. The first time she stood in line for a meal, she could hardly believe what she was seeing was white bread. Real white bread, not the grey loaves stretched with potato flour, beet pulp, or other substitutes. On the other side of the tray lay a square-cut portion of meat, and next to it a ladleful of a white hot drink made from milk powder. When she sat down with her tray, the air in the hall was filled with unfamiliar food scents, the smell of meat, of flour, and the sweet steam of milk powder. That smell sent a chill up her spine, because it had been so very long since she had encountered food with such a high fat content. She took a sip of the milk powder drink. The taste was so thin it was almost transparent, yet still closer to milk than anything she had drunk during the war. She stared at the cup for a long time, and an indescribable absurdity rose in her heart. She had spent 2 full years on the anti-aircraft line, trying to save a city with mathematics and intuition, and now she was sitting in the enemy's mess hall, drinking the milk powder beverage they issued and eating their white bread. In that moment, the war felt strange and distant, as if it were happening in another world, and she herself was merely a misplaced shadow in the wrong location. The camp's daily life gradually settled into a rhythm. During the day, she was assigned light work in the laundry, the sewing room, or the kitchen. At night, she returned to the barracks and lay on her bunk listening to others talk. Most of the male prisoners came from the Western Front. They had been closer to real gunfire than she had, and had lost more comrades. As a female auxiliary, she instead became the listener to those stories. She seldom spoke. Only when others mentioned German cities would she lift her head slightly, and when she heard some night raid she herself had lived through, her gaze would pause for a moment without her realizing it, but she never volunteered anything about herself. There were very few female prisoners in the camp, so few that one could always spot them at a glance in the mess hall. They did not talk as intensely as the men. Most of the time they simply kept a polite distance, nodding to one another, quietly bearing the same sensation of not belonging to this place. A few months later, the camp's food supply shifted in subtle ways. Spring passed and summer began, and milk production at nearby farms increased. Occasionally the camp kitchen would receive a fresher ingredient. One morning, as Hanna carried her tray toward the serving line as usual, there was an unfamiliar scent in the air. It was not the sweetness of milk powder, but a thicker, warmer, more genuinely creamy smell. She could hardly trust her own sense of smell and thought for a moment it must be some kind of illusion. But in the next second, an American cook opened a huge metal container, the inner wall shining with a wet gloss, and on the surface inside, freshly stirred, there was a faint cloudy whiteness. The cook dipped in a long-handled ladle and lifted out a scoop of liquid. It poured from the edge of the ladle in a slow flow, its color deeper and more opaque than anything made from milk powder. She heard the prisoners in front of her complaining that it was too rich, and someone said he would rather have coffee than this. That tone of dislike sounded to her as if it came from another planet. When her turn came, the cook handed her a cup of liquid still wreathed in steam. She took the tin cup, its warmth biting into her fingertips. She lowered her head and stared at what was in the cup for a long time, and the rising smell made a tight ache spread across her chest. A ridiculous thought flickered through her mind. Perhaps this was some kind of fake drink, imitating milk powder but closer to real milk. Perhaps it had been made this way so prisoners could digest it more easily. Perhaps it was some mixture of sweeteners and fats. 5 years of war had taught her not to trust anything that claimed to be a real taste. It had been a long time since she had encountered anything her body could fully believe in. She sat down at a long table, the cup in her hands, and did not drink for a long while. Around her, voices, laughter, and the scraping of metal chairs on the floor wove together, but for her it was as if the world had shrunk to nothing but that shallow circle of milky white in the cup. She drew in a deep breath and slowly brought the cup to her lips. The moment the first mouthful entered, her body was almost struck by something indescribable. It was not the gentleness of her memory, nor the sweetness she had expected, but a sudden heaviness surging onto her tongue. The fat spread across a palate whose sense of taste had lain fallow for 5 years, and it even made her feel slightly nauseous. For someone long undernourished, that saturated richness was almost a foreign substance. Reflexively, she wanted to set the cup down, but in the next second that flavor dissolved deeper in her mouth and began slowly to release a warmth that had almost been forgotten. She thought of the milk pan, of the sound of the wooden spoon scraping through the cream, of a winter morning when she was 16 and her mother was boiling milk on the tiled stove, the window glass clouded with condensation, of her brother's smile as he dipped a fingertip into the cream, of the heat that always rose from the stove. All these images surged out from behind the dark, like a curtain suddenly torn open, catching her completely unprepared. Her hand started to tremble, not from the heat and not from fear, but because her body and her memory had had their defenses broken at the same instant. She tried hard to restrain herself, yet she could feel the bridge of her nose prickle and her eyes burn. She did not want anyone to see her loss of composure, but the lump rising in her chest was impossible to suppress. Another female prisoner sitting beside her asked softly if she was all right. Hanna shook her head but could not stop herself from murmuring a single sentence, so quiet it was almost swallowed by the steam. "This taste reminds me of home before the war." When she had said it, it was as if all strength had been drained from her body. The cup shook slightly in her hands, the milky liquid inside tapping gently against the rim. She did not dare drink further, nor did she dare set it down, and could only hold on to it as if it were some fragile rope. She did not speak again. The flood of memories made it hard for her to breathe. The enemy's camp, this foreign land, a continent thousands of kilometers away, the ruins of war. Everything was, in that moment, effortlessly pierced through by a single cup of milk. She had spent 5 years training herself into a cool, precise, flawless fire control operator, and yet in this warm liquid she suddenly understood that what war first stripped away was not cities and not weapons, but the kind of flavor that lets a person know she once lived a normal life. After that day, everything in the camp seemed to go on as before. The wake-up call sounded on time. The pipes in the washroom still spat water that smelled of rust. The clanging of utensils in the mess hall remained dull and repetitive, and American sentries walked their rounds along the fence at fixed hours. But for Hanna, the grain of the world had quietly changed. Folding laundry in the workroom, when her fingers brushed the rough edge of fabric, she would suddenly recall the feel of the rangefinder's grips in her hands under the night sky in the Ruhr. Helping in the kitchen to slice bread, as she watched the soft crumb of the white loaves, she would suddenly think of the almost weapon-hard black bread of the wartime camp. Sweeping the floor, when she heard cattle lowing far off, she would feel an invisible tug at her chest. That cup of milk was like a key, quietly opening doors she had sealed shut within herself during the war. She began to notice details she would not have noticed before. For example, the American cooks never deliberately made things difficult for the prisoners when they served food. They used a procedural, impartial manner to portion out nearly identical servings onto each tray. Or, in the sewing room, when she met an older American guard inspecting the machines, he would sigh softly and mention that his daughter back home was probably about her age. It was not friendliness, nor was it an attempt at kindness, just an unguarded sentence of ordinary truth. Yet it suddenly made her realize that the distance between guard and prisoner was sometimes smaller than wartime propaganda had led people to believe. She also began to pay attention to those around her who, like her, had lost something in the war. In the barracks there was a female prisoner from Hamburg with hollow cheeks who often twitched slightly in her sleep. Her home had been completely destroyed in the firestorm. The first time she ate white bread in the camp, she almost did not dare bite into it. Another girl from Stuttgart had studied dance before the war. Her feet had been frostbitten during the retreat, and now her legs trembled slightly whenever she walked. She reacted to high-calorie foods like a startled small animal, as if afraid she could not withstand this unfamiliar richness. Watching these girls and the emptiness still lingering in their eyes, Hanna suddenly saw that her composure on the anti-aircraft line had not come from strength, but from the fact that she had never had time to ask herself whether she, too, needed care. She had been trained into a precise component, a device that could turn smoke and fire into numerical judgments within a few seconds. She had always believed herself to be hardened beyond any need for tenderness, yet that one cup of milk made her realize that she was just like these other girls. Once, she too had been a child in some kitchen, quietly handed a warm drink by someone's gentle hand. From that day on, her behavior in the camp grew quieter but distinctly different. Whenever milk was handed out at breakfast, whether powdered or fresh, she would deliberately stand toward the back of the line. Not because she did not want to drink it, but because she wanted to watch the young prisoners ahead of her, who lowered their heads, whose shoulders trembled, whose eyes flickered when they smelled that familiar yet foreign scent. When someone could not finish their portion, she would pass her own to them. When she noticed a girl who looked thinner even than she was, she would slip her bread onto that girl's tray. The American guards turned a blind eye. They did not consider such small acts to pose any danger. To them, mutual aid among prisoners was simply normal human behavior, not a sign of a fighting group reforming itself. Hanna also began to see her past in a different light. In the Ruhr, after every air raid, she had believed she had done her part to protect the city. She had thought that as long as she calculated fast enough and accurately enough, certain buildings would not collapse, and certain families would be spared. That belief had carried her through countless nights. Yet, in the American camp, she saw a sky without smoke for the first time. She saw dusty fields, cows walking slowly, and children riding bicycles along the road outside the fence. Those sounds that did not belong to war drifted softly over the wire, as if to remind her that the world was never meant to exist perpetually under bombardment and flames. She began to understand that in those enemy aircraft whose positions she had plotted with such precision before the guns brought them down, there had also been young people pushed onto the battlefield by their era. She did not regret what she had done, for it had been her duty in war. But for the first time she could imagine without hostility that behind those fireballs falling from the sky there might have been a family whose kitchen once boiled milk, whose members had once waited beside a morning stove for someone to return. One afternoon she sat alone on a wooden post at the edge of the camp, looking out towards distant wheat fields. Sunlight fell on her uniform, the fabric already washed to a faded pallor. The wind came across the grass carrying an undeniable warmth, and she suddenly understood that what that cup of milk had brought her was not merely the return of taste, but an abrupt clarity, that she was living on not for the sake of a nation, but for things smaller and more real than that. Her changed behavior gradually drew the other girls in her barracks closer to her. One night a girl from Frankfurt quietly told her about losing her little sister just before the surrender. The girl spoke in a voice so low it seemed she was afraid the air itself might overhear. Hanna simply listened in silence and did not interrupt. When the girl finished, Hanna gave a small nod. It was the simplest possible response between two young women who belonged to neither side's victory. She never again spoke to anyone about her record in the Ruhr, never mentioned the city blocks she had helped defend with cold calculations, never mentioned that she had once been called the girl who could hear the heartbeat of the sky. Those past glories suddenly felt remote here. They lay discarded in time like tools, and all that remained was the memory of the 2 tears that had fallen when she held that cup of milk in her own hands. That was not defeat. It was a quiet awakening. During her days in the camp, the only habit she clung to was helping prisoners more fragile than herself whenever she could. If someone needed more time in the laundry, she would take their place. If someone felt faint from hunger, she would push her own bread over. If someone woke in the night from a nightmare, she would murmur, "You are safe now." She never considered what these actions might make of her, nor did she ever think of them as a way to offset any guilt. She simply found that after that cup of milk she could no longer lock her feelings and memories away as she had before. The war had once compressed her into a rigid piece of machinery, a part that allowed no surplus emotion. Now, however, the Midwestern summer, the creamy smell wafting from the mess hall, the wheat swaying in the wind, and the young women in the camp together formed a slow and authentic rhythm she had never experienced. For the first time, she realized she was learning how to exist as an ordinary person, rather than as a construct of numbers and angles drilled into her. Autumn arrived, as it always did, without fanfare. Outside the camp, leaves turned from deep green to gold, then fell from the branches and lay along the path to the grain silos. As news of the end of the European war reached the American mainland, the atmosphere in the prisoner of war camp gradually eased. The American guards were a little less tense, and meetings in the camp began to discuss repatriation. Letters announcing the process were delivered one after another. The first time Hanna saw the word repatriation, her fingertips tingled slightly, as if the world were suddenly reminding her that she still belonged to that land torn apart by war. The procedures for sending prisoners home took several weeks. They had to be filed in order, examined, registered, then assigned to transport lists. Life in the camp went on, but the air was more and more suffused with an indefinable sense of waiting. Some prisoners fantasized about their first meal after they returned home. Some feared that their homes had been completely destroyed. Some anxiously wondered whether they would ever find work again. As she listened to these conversations, no clear picture formed in her mind. She could not imagine what going home would look like, nor whether her parents were still milking cows on the farm, nor whether the kitchen that had held so much of her youth still had its old stove. Even when they were put on trains, transferred to a port on the East Coast, and finally boarded a ship bound for Europe, she maintained a kind of near-blank calm. What she felt more sharply was the odd weight the American camp had left in her heart. No matter how she told herself it was enemy territory, the sky and air there had given her a long-lost chance to breathe, had let her, for the first time, glimpse a possible life beyond war. The engine noise in the ship's hold shook the iron floor constantly, and the prisoners' conversations bounced off the cramped metal walls in echoes. Sitting on her bunk, she looked at her own hands and suddenly realized that the feeling of the tin cup that had once held fresh milk was still as clear as if it had happened only moments ago. Back in Europe, they were taken to temporary reception camps. Standing outside one of them, she saw a desolate landscape veiled in a thin mist, abandoned rail lines with half-rusted carriages, and a low grey sky pressing down on everything. Walking past these sights, she felt no shock, only a kind of muted pain that she had never experienced in America. She understood that the American camp had been run by rules, rations, and international agreements, whereas her own country had been completely squeezed dry in the final years of the war, leaving behind only a barely supported shell. A few weeks later, she finally received a pass that allowed her to leave the reception center. The paper was so thin it was almost transparent, printed with her name, place of birth, and a few simple remarks. She walked back toward Lower Saxony along broken roads, passing burned-out farms, collapsed bridges, and towns dismantled into shattered pieces. She saw people building fires in front of ruins to cook soup, people washing pots dredged from the rubble, and people leading horses, reduced to skin and bone, trying to plow soil that had lain fallow. As she walked, she felt as if she were crossing a world that had lost its sound. When she finally reached home, a light rain was falling from the sky. Sections of the farm fence were broken, beams in the cowshed sagged slightly, and the yard was piled with the leftovers of tools that had been sold off under wartime quotas. She stood at the door without going in, simply looking quietly at the land that had once been so familiar. When her mother opened the door, she froze for a few seconds, unable to believe that the girl standing there was the same child who had left with a neat face and a small bag on her back. Her father came out of the cowshed holding an old milk pail, and at the moment he saw her, the pail slipped from his hand and clattered to the ground, white liquid splashing onto the mud. As her family held her tightly, she smelled that long-absent scent, not the sweet aroma of boiled milk powder from the American mess, not the rich warmth of the pre-war kitchen, but a faint, milky smell thinned by years of war and poverty. It carried the dampness of water, the fatigue of underfed cattle, and the stubborn persistence of a farm just barely kept going. Her mother hurried to pour the remaining milk from the pail into a pot, saying she would boil a hot cup for her, saying she had loved boiled milk since she was small, saying she needed it now more than ever. The milk in the pot slowly warmed over the fire, the curve of the liquid's motion almost making her afraid to breathe. As her mother stirred it, the water and fat did not separate as they had before the war, and the color of the milk was paler than she remembered. When her mother poured the first cup and handed it to her, she held it and felt the warmth seep into her palms, but it did not strike her sense of taste as violently as that fresh milk in the American camp had done. She took a sip. The flavor was so faint it was almost like mist. Yet behind that thin, almost vanishing taste, she sensed something she could not easily name. It was not the richness of before the war, nor the unfamiliar abundance of the prisoner-of-war camp, but the flavor that can only be boiled by those who have chosen to keep living on amid the ruins. She set the cup on the stove and watched the steam gradually evaporate. She suddenly realized that whatever the circumstances, she was once again standing in this kitchen. Here there were no camp tables, no numbers, no barbed wire, only the sound of her parents breathing beside her, and a way of life interrupted for years by wind and rain, now trying quietly to resume. In the years that followed, she became the most ordinary person in the village. She helped at the cooperative to record milk yields and worked during harvest season. Everything went on as if the war had never happened. Only at night did she sometimes recall the flashes over the Ruhr, the markings on the rangefinder, and the days when her comrades had called her the girl who could hear the heartbeat of the sky. Those days were like a darkened room, sealed by time, and only when she closed her eyes would a faint light seep out. Many years later, when people in the town began collecting oral histories, she was invited to speak about her experiences in the war. Many witnesses spoke of battles, of flight, of bombardment, of life and death. She sat on a chair in front of the recorder, yet she did not begin with any record of her achievements. She did not mention downed aircraft, did not mention the fire control tables, did not mention the nights she had spent in the Ruhr. She spoke only of one morning in the American prisoner of war camp, of the feeling in her chest when she lifted that cup of warm, fresh milk, of the moment she suddenly realized that she had not drunk real milk in many years. Her voice was so soft, it was as if she feared disturbing something, and the man operating the recorder had to lean in to catch every word. She said she had never expected that the first thing to vanish in war would not be cities or soldiers, but the seemingly trivial flavors of everyday life. She said that when she drank that cup of milk in the American camp, it was as if her body remembered a language long forgotten. That language was gentle and slow, yet left a deeper impression than any victory or defeat. War, she said, had never been only about guns and shells, but also about absent fragrances, absent food, and absent calm. When the recording ended, no one in the room spoke. She gave a slight nod and asked the staff to switch off the machine. Stepping outside, she felt sunlight on her face and narrowed her eyes, looking toward the land that had grown soft through years of cultivation. From a small house at the edge of the field came the faint clatter of pots and pans, as if someone were preparing breakfast. The sound made her pause involuntarily, as though she needed to confirm that the world was now at peace enough for any kitchen to function normally again. Many years earlier, she had sat at a long table in an American prisoner of war camp and held that cup of fresh milk for the first time, tears falling onto the rim. Many years later, she stood in a quiet village under gentle weather and saw children lining up at school to receive milk. That scene seemed, across time, to answer the tears she had shed back then. It was not proof of victory or defeat, but a silent kind of repair, stitching the world back together little by little from the edge of the ruins. She rarely spoke of those days again. What the war left in her was not hatred, but a calm remembrance, one that made her feel a slight yet tangible weight whenever she drank an ordinary cup of milk. She knew that she had once heard the sky's heartbeat at night, and that she had once let numbers on a firing line decide life and death. But the only thing she was willing to recall again and again was that day in a foreign land when she lifted a cup of warm, fresh milk and suddenly realized that she was still someone with a home, with memories, and with a sense of taste.